if he wants to talk to you about setting up groups, fantastic. I definitely want to go. I'm sure that you guys would be interested. He's going to give you some sign-up opportunities soon. So, Dr. Charles Finney.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can hear me. Question real quick. How many of you have studied abroad ever? Raise your hand. Woo! Okay, how many of you are thinking you might want to study abroad sometime during your undergraduate year? Woo! Yeah! All right, good enough. That's a good start. I'd like to talk specifically about a program that's going through this summer. It's a program I've led since 2009. We had it suspended because of COVID. It's back now, right? So this is an opportunity to travel to 3 regions of Peru. We begin in the Pacific Coast region, where the capital city is, where ancient civilization stood long before the Inca people were there. It's also where the colonial center of all Spanish dominion of South America was located, and it is the capital of modern Peru. So this is a very important center of power and politics, and we'll be spending some time there. We're also going to be going, actually, hello. Oh, wow, yeah. We will, while in Lima, also be spending time in a place called Canto Grande. This is a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city of Lima. It's a very poor neighborhood. It's a place I lived for a number of years, and so we go there to see how different people in Peru see the world differently and experience the world differently, and how they see politics and history differently. We go from there to the Andes Mountains. The Andes Mountains are the second highest mountain range in the world, and amidst the Andes Mountains is the seat of the ancient Inca Empire. Among the beautiful things you can see is this place. It's called Machu Picchu. That's an OU student who was with us a few years ago. We go up before dawn, watch the sunrise over this place. It's just a magnificent locale on top of a mountain. It's a mountaintop city. We also visit a number of other Inca sites, and we visit contemporary people who live in indigenous communities where they speak Quechua, and we learn from them about what the world looks like from their point of view. From the Andes, we go into the Amazon basin. Down the other side of the mountains, we're now in the basin of the Amazon River. We'll be on the Tambopata River, which is a tributary of the Amazon, and in the rainforest. We take a boat like the one you see upstream, and from there we hike into a place that we stay. No roads, no electricity. It's just a beautiful site in the midst of the rainforest. The local people, also an indigenous group, are our guides. They take us into the forest to see animals and such like the ones you see here. These are actually photographs that I took while on trip with with Oklahoma students, University of Oklahoma students. So this is part of a course. The course is on the history and politics of Peru. There's a bunch of interesting topics that we'll be taking up, both ancient and much more current, about politics and problems in Peru, including terrorism, the stability of democracy, and the conflict between resource development and environment and community interests. If you are interested, the deadline for application is the 25th of February, a week from Friday. I am going to pass out a sign-up sheet if you would like more information. So beginning here, if you could make sure that gets to the back, and if these could work their way to the back, I'll wait at the back to pick them up. If you're interested in more information, please put your name and your email address. Finally, 2 things. One, I think that studying abroad is the single most transformative thing that you can do while an undergraduate student at this university. It is also something that you will never have an opportunity to do again in the same way. This is the time to have those experiences that you will cherish the rest of your life, memories that you will have, friendships that you will build, because when you travel with people, you often build lasting friendships. So please consider studying abroad in this program or in any program that this university offers. If you are concerned that you do not have the financial means to make this possible, understand that there are scholarships. And if you contact the Education Abroad people, they will help you see how to get this done in your particular case. So do not assume that you cannot do this, right? There are people with whom you can work and ways of getting this done. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to the next presentation.
Okay, guys, so a couple of quick announcements. On Friday, you have your first essay due over either Killers of the Flower Moon or Invisible Man. I have had people write about The Invisible Man, which, while a sci-fi classic by H.G. Wells, is not what we're going for. We're going for Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, okay? So, that's due on Friday. Eric has a tip, right? His tip is, it's D-U-E Friday, not D-O Friday. You know who you are, all right? So get those papers done. I look forward to reading them, and because now that's something I get to do. And and I'm going to hand it over to Ella Chocote-Taylor, and she is going to talk to us about mass incarceration, but she's also going to talk to us about rights of the accused. Those questions are up, and you guys should be able to see them on Canvas. Ella, take it away.
All right, can everybody hear? Can everybody in the back hear me? Cool. All right. So, thank you, Dr. Rowlett. As Dr. Rowlett said, I am Ella Taylor. I am a master's student here at OU. I am studying political science, emphasizing in public policy, and Native American studies, emphasizing in tribal governance and policy. Some of you I might be familiar. I'm your TA, but I'm also another TA for this class, if you don't have me. So, first and foremost, are any of you in here criminal justice majors? Raise your hand. All right, I just have a couple. All right, shout out to y'all. I was also a criminal justice major as an undergrad, so that's why I'm going to be discussing mass incarceration in the United States with y'all today. So, right to the accused. The due process rights and the procedural guarantees provided by the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, and 14th Amendments are the most crucial aspects of knowing your rights as individuals. So, knowing your rights regarding the 4th Amendment, it protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, but you may be searched in regards to houses, documents, your person. When granted, whenever law enforcement is granted a warrant, have probable cause or reasonable suspicion. They don't need a warrant if items are in plain view or you give them consent. Make sure if you're getting pulled over that you recognize that. You give consent, then you automatically lose your 4th Amendment right.
They say, knock, knock, can I come in? And you say,
no. All right, so 5th Amendment, prevent self-incrimination and double jeopardy. Does anybody know what double jeopardy is? Can't be tried for the same thing twice. Yes. So, an important aspect of the 4th Amendment is the Due Process Clause. Important note here, this is only regarding the federal government and depriving your life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. So that's an important note from here. It also gives you the right to a grand jury. So that's another due process aspect of this piece of legislation. That really helps out in regards to individuals being able to have their rights expressed in a way that actually goes to a jury in a trial. Has anybody heard of your Miranda rights? Woo! Everybody should know your Miranda rights. If you haven't watched a criminal justice series or something along those lines, you may have seen them read a little bit of their Miranda rights, even though sometimes they didn't say the whole thing or didn't say it correctly. But regardless, a lot of us are exposed to Miranda versus Arizona. That was enacted in 1966, or was a case of 1966. And essentially, it informs suspects of their right to silence and their right to an attorney. So every single individual in here has a right to an attorney And that should be something that you really take out of the Fifth Amendment. You have the right not to incriminate yourself, and you have the right to an attorney. Exclusionary rule, something that we don't necessarily talk about a whole lot. Not a whole lot of attention is given to this exclusionary rule, even though it is extremely important in regards to the fact it bars the use of illegals evidence seized at trial. So if like law enforcement comes into your house without a warrant and gets paraphernalia that you may have and tries to charge you with that paraphernalia, like say you're using heroin or something and they come into your house and they take that paraphernalia, that is essentially seizing evidence that is illegally obtained, so therefore it can't be used against you. And this precedent is established largely by Mapp versus Ohio in 1961, which is a huge monumental case all throughout criminal justice in regards to establishing precedents in regards to illegal seized evidence. And also we kind of see a growing number of good faith exceptions. And in regards to the case that is presented, Herring versus the United States, these are kind of called honest mistakes. So in this case, it was an outdated warrant, the wrong address, the wrong name, and death of an innocent. So if all of these components are wrong, then that warrant, whoever you applied it to, or whoever you're serving it to, is automatically void. It does not apply to them. And yet, individuals are charged with these crimes all the time. So that's an interesting aspect that's kind of been coming out in recent cases, is these good faith exceptions that are extremely important to understanding discretion in the criminal justice system. So, Sixth Amendment, this is kind of a lengthy one. So you have a right to a speedy trial, you have the right to a lawyer. This is an important emphasis, only in criminal court. You don't have a right to a lawyer in civil court. So that is extremely important to note, as well as you have a right to a jury trial. So typically juries are 6 to 12 people, depending on if you are in civil or criminal court. So for criminal it's 12 typically, and for civil it's 6. And you have a right to a public trial. So all of us are entitled to opinion or a public trial, but the issue with public trials is that they have the potential, as we've seen in recent cases, to involve media bias or public opinion within these cases, and it is not based on fact of the case, and that can have huge detriments to the amount of individuals that are incarcerated every year. So also, you have the right to a place of prosecution, so the right of venue. So say that you are living, for those that are tribally enrolled, you're living on a reservation, and you know all the individuals within that community. And so you know like who the judge is, who the prosecutors are, and they have a relationship with you outside of this. So you think that their judgment would be biased. So you can ask for a change of venue and go into a federal or state court based on that. You have a right to change your venue. So the right to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusations that an individual is claiming towards you, you have the right to know. So Confrontation Clause is what we also have a right to that extends on this. And it essentially is the right to confront your accuser. Which kind of goes into compulsory clause, and it's a defendant's right to subpoena a witness in their favor, but the defense typically does not do this because it is up to the prosecution to prove without a reasonable doubt that this defendant actually indeed committed that crime. So they don't have to, the defense does not have to present any information to incriminate their client or make any claims at all, except for counterclaims. All right, your 8th Amendment protects you against cruel and unusual punishment. So the death penalty was actually ruled unconstitutional for a period in the 1970s, but 27 states today still use capital punishment. So you can see in Bays versus Rees in 2008, it upholds the constitutionality of lethal injection, even if there's missing chemical compounds of that lethal injection. So the individual essentially could potentially not die from this lethal injection, which is an issue. So my question is the death penalty ethical or moral? Based on these criteria of what morality is and what ethics are, do you believe that this is a reasonable or ethical or moral practice that we should continue on in the United States? I want to get a show of hands or an input from someone. Ish?
I guess it depends on me, like if someone is just so dangerous that, keeping them alive would just harm other people, like maybe they have a lot of control or something, I think at that point, I guess like a rampant serial killer.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Whenever we think of the death penalty, we're kind of on opposite spectrums sometimes. Go ahead.
I would say I'm against it just because I'm sure you know the exact number, but isn't it like 1 in 20 convictions are wrong or something like that?
I don't know the exact stats, I don't want to misquote, but yes, it's significantly high. We have a lot of individuals, like as we'll see later on, the Innocence Project is one of the organizations that's working to, with incarcerated individuals, to limit the amount of individuals that are actually being wrongly accused and then also lethally injected based on what they've been accused for. So,
I think it's important that our laws are not always based off morality.
Yes.
Nor should they be. Because if you base them off religion and culture, they're going to change.
Exactly, and I think with morality, we have a conception that they should be together and working in harmony within our political system, but that's not how it works. We base more off of ethics than we do off morality. Because like Eric said, morality changes based on your religion, based on your culture, and it's your own personal values or beliefs that come into play. Unlike ethics that have principles that guide the standards and behaviors of individual society or system or organization. So 14th Amendment. This is the second half of Due Process Clause, but it constrains only at a state level. Important takeaway, state level. And prohibits states from depriving any persons of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, do y'all remember back to a few weeks ago whenever we got this from John Locke, who eventually was taken by Thomas Jefferson and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness instead of property? All right, well, this is where it extends into our legislation besides just in our Constitution. To property and not just pursuit of happiness. So, it also granted citizenship to individuals born and naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved. So this actually has impacted significant civil rights movements throughout the last 60, 70 years. So I want you all to go, and I'm going to pull this up, but we're going to get on our phones or computers or whatever for a second, and we're going to answer these questions. And so,
You mind if I take attendance first? Ella, you mind if I take attendance?
yeah.
I got a megaphone.
Attendance is live.
Awesome. All right. So Eric has stated. Let me know if you can't get in or if you're having any issues replying. Is everybody good? Can they have access? Yes? There's like 200 of you in here. Can I get a yes? Awesome, thank you. I'm gonna give you all about a minute to do this.
Tell them how to do it.
So,
I've never done it. Text that to that. Then fix your message. No, that's a text message. That's why it says text. Yeah. Tell them to text that to that.
okay, so you can text that number 22333 and then just put in your responses. It's not that difficult with the that way instead of just going to the actual website. It's looking like discrimination is an overarching term that y'all are pointing out. And yeah, a lot of mass incarceration has to do with discrimination amongst minority populations and in impoverished areas. And it's interesting that y'all are talking about corporate aspects of mass incarceration, because we'll be talking about that a little bit later. As well as the system being biased. Something I would like to point out about bias is that we're all inherently biased. So, of course, our criminal justice system is biased. We have discretion for a reason, and it can be both good and bad, as I will express later, but it's still inherently present. So I think that's an important thing to touch on, as well as slavery. That is... I don't know if a lot of you know, but with the 13th Amendment, you have the right to institutionalize slavery if you are convicted of a crime. It may limit slavery on a mass scale in general society, but that is not the case in regards to that specific part of the 13th Amendment. And so it contributes to a lot of other factors that go into mass incarceration. So, yeah, great thoughts, y'all. And yeah, so going forward, we're going to watch a short little video, about a minute long, about 3 things that you really need to know about mass incarceration that'll help you. So I'm going to go ahead and give it off to Carrie Johnson.
The country's been having a debate about mass
Can y'all hear?
incarceration. Americans locked up, whether there's a better place for many of them, like community supervision or drug treatment. First off, jail does not mean the same thing as prison. Jails are run by state and local authorities, but for people who have not yet been sentenced or serving very short sentences of a year or less. Second, Congress has been having a debate about how it punishes people in the federal system, but the federal system houses only a tiny fraction of all the offenders in the U.S., about 196,000 at last count. The vast majority of people locked up live in state or local facilities. Finally, the Justice Department recently announced it's going to phase out the use of private prisons. Those for-profit facilities are in 13 locations around the country, but that decision does not apply to the Department of Homeland Security, which houses tens of thousands of immigrant detainees around the country. Those systems are run by for-profit contractors, and that's unlikely to change at this point.
All right. Something interesting to kind of give a personal tie to federal prisons. I actually moved here from Colorado last July, and we have a federal penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, and it actually houses El Chapo. And if you've ever seen Silence of the Lambs, the guy that inspired that is actually housed there. I got to do a tour of the federal penitentiary, not go into the areas where those violent offenders were, but I still got to tour the facility. It's very interesting. But yeah, so just getting to see correctional facilities makes you look at it a little bit different. So risk factors that contribute to mass incarceration. So these are kind of some overarching theories that the criminal justice field really harps on, is that you are socially learning behaviors from your family, from your communities, the people around you. So even if you're not always knowledgeable about the learned behaviors that you've accumulated over time, they still impact you on a daily basis. And also your environment. So a person's spatial environment impacts their likelihood to commit a crime. So this kind of goes hand in hand with a theory called broken windows theory, which means that individuals that live in communities that have large amounts of graffiti, broken windows on buildings, have a lack of like non-open businesses that are just vacant, they are more likely to have higher crime rates in those areas. And then we also lead into mental illness. So a lot of individuals don't think of homelessness, but it is a component because of the fact that a lot of these individuals have mental illnesses, like schizophrenia or bipolar, and they end up on the street because they can't function in normal society, whether not being on meds or whatever the case may be. There are individuals in here that may potentially have some background with that, whether it's psychology in the psychology field or whatever the case may be, but it impacts them as well and many other aspects that can contribute to mass incarceration. So how does mass incarceration manifest? How does it happen? So excessive bail is supposedly prohibited within your constitutional rights. But for minority populations, the bail that is asked for in regards to the crimes that are committed is higher than a lot of their incomes. So they can, even if they go and get bail bonds, they don't have the likelihood of being able to pay that money back. And so essentially, it makes it almost impossible to get their family members or their community members out of this prison system. And then mandatory minimum sentencing. It takes away from the discretion of the court system, which is both good and bad, as I've already stated. And so minimum sentencing requires that individuals serve a certain standard amount of time, regardless if their situations are completely different, but they have similar circumstances. And so it's unequally applied to cases. And then 3 strikes laws, we will be discussing that a little bit later in the presentation. And then truth in sentencing laws essentially means that whenever you are sentenced to a certain length of time, you have to serve a portion of that specific amount of time, regardless, to get probate or parole. And then also the war on drugs, as we've seen with Ronald Reagan administration, that is extended into present day. And then harsh punishment for nonviolent crimes. So individuals that have gotten arrested with small amounts of marijuana, for instance, and they're still serving sentences in our correctional facilities for those things. Problematic in probation and parole. So with probation and parole, individuals kind of get these interchangeably mixed up. And probation is whenever you are before you actually end up in a jail system, this is almost like a tactic to make it to where you don't end up in the system. And then for parole, that's whenever you've actually been released and you have a certain mandatory requirements to get off that parole. And the problem with this is that it varies state to state, and it really just depends on the different elements, like I said, of that state to figure out how you're actually going to go through the probation and parole process. And a lack of mental health services. That's something that we harp on a lot in criminal justice, is public health resources and lack of them in desolate areas such as tribal nations across the United States. Longer sentences and more life sentences. as it kind of goes hand in hand with the 3 strikes law, as we'll be discussing a little later. And then private prisons and profit motive. This is also something that is an extensive issue for states, and we will be discussing that a little bit more in depth as well. So 3 strikes law. It consists of an individual is convicted in federal court of a serious violent felony and has 2 or more prior convictions in federal or state courts, and at least one of which is a serious violent felony. And it can also include serious drug offenses, but the issue with this is that we still have individuals being charged as low-level crimes, but they're still being put into correctional facilities at an unprecedented rate. So this is the statute that this comes from, and it's important to recognize that it is essentially to not allow for the continuation of criminal enterprise in regards to the continuation of serious drug offenses. And then plea bargains to prison pipelines. So the issue with plea bargains is that it requires you to waive your 5th and 6th Amendment rights. So more than 90% of defendants plead guilty rather than go to trial. And that's a significant issue, especially whenever you have the right to not only due process, but to not self-incriminate, which you're automatically doing whenever you plead guilty to something. And your 6th Amendment, you're giving up that the ability to confront your accuser. So essentially, plea bargaining is constitutional, and it's still accepted in the court if it's done properly. So you have to have these 3 components. It has to be voluntary, knowingly, and understandingly that an individual is giving up these rights when signing a plea bargain. So privatization of correctional facilities. As you can see, it's a cycle of expansion, and it involves political influence, mass incarceration, a cost to taxpayers, and tax breaks and revenue. So as you can see, in just 1 year, the GEO group, PACT, sent $518,000 approximately dollars on political contributions, and then approximately $700,000 on lobbying. So essentially, they're kind of a conglomerate of the American Legislative Exchange Council. So if y'all know Johnson & Johnson, some bigger corporations like Kroger, all of these bigger institutions and corporations, corporations are kind of under this exchange council, and they're advocating for themselves and their own interests. So the public interest isn't taken into account into this. And it affects mass incarceration in the sense that we've seen a 784% increase between 1990 and 2010. And private prisons currently control 90% of immigrant detention centers, as we saw with the video earlier. And this costs taxpayers a significant amount. So $39 million or billion dollars since 2000. And the federal budget just continues to double. And with tax breaks and revenue regarding these institutions or corporations, that they're receiving $6.3 million in real estate investment tax trust tax breaks alone in 2012. So if you can think about that, how many tax breaks not only Amazon and all these other individuals are getting, but we're also doing it for private correctional facilities. Isn't that interesting? So the economics of correctional facilities. Overinvestment by states in private correctional facilities costs states more money. But private corporations are making the profit, as you saw in the last slide. So, and another issue is that only non-violent offenders are housed at private correctional facilities. So these private corporations lobby for harsh drug laws to keep their beds full. And also, private federal correctional facilities do not make as much money. So they don't want to put out money if they're not going to get any investment or economic resources out of that, or ROI, I guess I should say. So we're going to go on again and pull out our phones and try to put in some input regarding to what is the school to prison pipeline, what are some contributing factors.
SROs, that's an interesting one.
Did you point out that SROs?
They didn't put our name.
So it's looking like poverty is a overarching theme, as well as racism, as well as discrimination like we saw last. Underfunding. Yeah, that's a huge issue, underfunding. In the United States, we actually decreased our budget for the education aspect of our fiscal budget for the 2022-2023 budget. And so I felt like that was pretty interesting to note, that whenever we're seeing like the fiscal budgets come out, that you really need to be paying attention to what your money's going towards. You're the constituents. You're paying taxes for a reason. And taxes, as an individual said. So these are definitely crucial elements of what contributes to school to prison pipelines. So, school to prison pipelines. Student experiences in high schools today are different than they were 60 years ago. Students experience prison-like environments nowadays. So, for me personally, I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. I went to Little Rock Central High School for about a month before I moved to Colorado. And every single day I had to walk through a detection monitor scanner every single day, leaving and coming to school. And it's because of the fact that we were geographically located on the boundaries between Bloods and Crips. So we had an extensive amount of violence, an extensive amount of poverty, an extensive amount of issues and challenges within the community that were straining our ability to be treated as individuals that are not prisoners. Harsh school discipline. Individuals are taken out of classrooms for things that are petty, such as behavioral control issues that may be related to ADHD, things that individuals may not be able to necessarily be aware of all the time. But also underinvestment, as we discussed. There's a lack of economic investment in education right now. Pressures and uncertainty. As we've seen with COVID, there's been a lot of school closings. So I know a lot of freshmen and sophomores in here have not had class in person for 1 to 2 years of their high school experience. And that detrimented you in a lot of ways, I'm assuming, just with having to get back in the role of things of being in a social environment where you have to talk to other individuals face to face and not over a screen. So that's impacted our ability to socialize and communicate with one another. And I really wish that my computer would stop closing. But out-of-school suspensions. So over 3 million receive out-of-school detention a year. We're systematically allowing our children not to go to school because of the fact that they have behavior issues or they have done something that we deem as wrong. But yet, we're not investing in helping them overcome hurdles and challenges within their own communities, within their own environmental or social interactions with the world. So, school arrests. Over 70% of students arrested were Hispanic, Black, or Native American. But Native Americans typically aren't represented in these studies just because of the fact that they're such a small percentage of our population. They're only 2%. So data is largely inaccurate in the last couple of years in regards to this because it's constantly changing. So over 67% of school arrests in Florida are for minor misdemeanor charges. Could you imagine being incarcerated just for something like a misdemeanor? Do you know what a misdemeanor is? Anyone? Go ahead. Yeah.
Isn't it like something small that's like not a major crime, is like having possession of marijuana?
I'm going to refer to Dr. Roulette for the definition of misdemeanor because she gave such an incredible one last class.
A misdemeanor is a minor crime that does not range in relevance to a felony. A felony is going to end up in jail time. Misdemeanors often just have fines. They include things like speeding, disturbing the peace, trespassing is a misdemeanor. And so these are good examples of how minor the crimes we're talking about.
Thank you. All right. So juvenile detention centers, the purpose of them is to confine only, emphasizing only, those youth who are serious, violent, or chronic offenders pending legal action. And it is not appropriate for status offenders regarding truancy, curfew violations, and youth that commit technical violations of probation. Yet, approximately 4,000 youth are held in detention centers for these low-level offenses. And this is an overarching issue because of the fact that we have such a large amount of youth that are being put into detention centers whenever these individuals should be learning and socially growing within their communities. Because once you get labeled as a delinquent or an individual that has been incarcerated, it is extremely hard to get out of that social label. It impacts you for the rest of your life. A lot of you are sitting in here because of the fact that you've never gotten in any legal trouble. You have the opportunity to sit in the seat that you are sitting in because you have civilly engaged in a perceived positive way by not violating any laws. I mean, everybody violates laws every single day that we don't always know about, but regardless. And this leads into pretrial detention, it becomes more common because judges choose to detain youth in 26% of delinquency cases, which essentially means that the number of youth in juvenile facilities continues to increase, which is important to note.
Ellen.
Go ahead.
Are juvenile facilities allowed to be privatized institutions, or do they have to be ran?
They can be privatized. Yeah, it's interesting how privatization of detention centers as well as jails and prisons happens and how we kind of disproportionately.
We can have a big discussion of the constitutionality of private prisons anytime you guys want to come to my office.
Yes, they're always great discussions. So as you can see with the pie chart, how many youth are actually locked up in the United States and the different categories that they're grouped in. So you can see like reception and diagnostic centers and the related charges like property, drug, public order to be there, violations of something, a status, Indian country. So it breaks it down into these different levels, but you see overarchingly that over 48,000 youth are being held in facilities away from their home as a result of juvenile or criminal justice involvement. So this is significant just because of the fact that we are so continuously looking to create these proactive policies that aren't always necessarily proactive for all portions of the population, and it's proven to not be beneficial for even adults, the privatization of these facilities. So, thank you for your time. Do you have any questions? Cool.
So, with regards to private prisons, is there anything you can tell us about mandatory minimum capacity laws?
So it depends on states, and also it depends on the facility. Because if they're larger, they can house more inmates. But if they don't have as much funding and they're smaller institutions,